Story 1. Photos from the darkness. It started like any other day. I was scrolling through my phone, killing time, when I decided to clear out my gallery. My storage was filling up with random screenshots, blurry photos of my shoes and the occasional accidental video. But as I scrolled through the thumbnails, something caught my eye. There were a few photos I didn't recognize. They were dark, grainy, and hard to make out at first. The first was a blurry shot of a pillow. My pillow. The second showed the edge of my blanket, the pattern unmistakably mine. I frowned, trying to remember when I could have taken them. It wasn't uncommon for me to accidentally snap pictures with my phone unlocked in my pocket, but the more I looked at them, the less sense it made. These weren't random accidental photos. They were deliberate. The third photo made my stomach twist. It was taken from my bed, and the angle was low, as though someone was lying there pointing the camera at the wall. I could see the faint outline of my door in the background, slightly ajar. The fourth was even worse. This one showed me. It was lying on the bed, my face partially turned away, my eyes closed. The light from my bedside lamp cast a faint glow over the room, illuminating the scene. I was asleep. A cold chill ran down my spine as I stared at the image. The angle, it wasn't one I could have taken myself. I scrolled to the last photo, my hand trembling. It was a close-up. The image was so sharp, so clear, that I could see every detail of my face. My eyes were closed, my lips slightly parted, the faint shadow of my breath visible in the dim light. And in the corner of the frame, just barely visible, was a hand holding the phone. I dropped the phone, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The room around me felt suddenly smaller, darker, the shadows in the corners deeper than they should have been. Someone had been here. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. I lived alone. My apartment was small, secure, and on the third floor. The locks were intact. There was no way someone could have gotten in without me noticing. But the photos didn't lie. I grabbed my phone again, my fingers trembling as I swiped through the images. I zoomed in on the last one, focusing on the hand holding the phone. It was pale, the knuckles slightly bony, but it wasn't distinct enough to identify. Whoever it was, they'd been standing right there, close enough to touch me. I checked the locks twice that night. I closed the curtains, turned on every light, and paced the apartment until exhaustion finally forced me to sit down. The phone sat on the table in front of me, its screen dark, as if mocking me. I didn't dare open the gallery again, but as I stared at it, a thought occurred to me. When were the photos taken? My stomach churned as I opened the gallery one more time, navigating to the details of the last image. The timestamp stared back at me, cold and unchanging. A phone rang, making me jump several times out of my skin. It had been taken the night before, at 3:17 a.m. I felt the blood drain from my face as the realization hit me. I hadn't locked my bedroom door that night. I couldn't sleep. The phone sat on my nightstand, its dark screen facing me like an unblinking eye. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the old pipes, sent a jolt of fear through me. I couldn't stop thinking about the photos, the pale hand, the close-up of my face. The timestamp burned in my mind, 3:17 a.m. I didn't wake up. I didn't hear anything. How was that possible? I told myself it had to be a prank. Maybe someone hacked into my phone, took the photos remotely, and uploaded them to scare me. It was a flimsy explanation, but it was better than the alternative, that someone had been in my room. I locked the bedroom door that night. I checked it twice, pulling on the handle to make sure it wouldn't budge. Then I shoved a chair under the doorknob for good measure, but it didn't make me feel safer. The hours crawled by as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. My heart pounded with every faint sound from the apartment. Was that the wind? The fridge? the floor settling? Or was it something else? I must have drifted off at some point because the next thing I knew, I was waking up. And then I realized it was after the next breath. It motivated me at all. I needed to fight something too, and the more I did, the more I felt connected. The room was dark, except for the faint glow of the street lights seeping through the curtains. My phone buzzed softly on the nightstand, the vibration startling me awake. It was only after the second ring that I realized it was evening. I grabbed it, squinting at the screen. A notification. A new photo added to gallery. My blood ran cold as I stared at the message. My thumb hovered over the notification, every instinct screaming at me to leave it alone. But I couldn't help myself. Opened the gallery. The silhouette was glamored this time. It was taken from the same angle as before, directly in front of my face. But this time, my eyes were open. I didn't remember waking up. Panic gripped me as I scrambled out of bed, my phone clutched tightly in my hand. The image stared back at me, frozen on the screen. My own face, wide-eyed and terrified, captured in excruciating detail. This wasn't just a prank. Someone was watching me. I tore through the apartment, checking every door, every window, every possible hiding place, but there was no one there. The locks were intact, the windows shut tight. It didn't make sense. By the time the sun rose, I was still awake, pacing the living room. The fear had settled into my bones, gnawing at me with every passing minute. I put the winch on and began pulling things off when I noticed the garage was closed. I didn't know what else to do, so I called the police. The officer who came to my apartment listened patiently as I explained what had happened. I showed him the photos, my voice shaking as I pointed out the timestamps. He frowned, scrolling through the gallery. "Are you sure these weren't staged?" he asked. "What?" I said, incredulous. "It's possible you set these up yourself," he continued, though his tone was uncertain. "Sleepwalking, maybe? Stress can do strange things." I wanted to scream. The suggestion was ridiculous. I would never. The officer handed the phone back to me, his expression unreadable. "We'll file a report," he said, "but there's not much we can do, unless something else happens." That night, I didn't even bother trying to sleep. I sat in the living room, my back to the wall, clutching a heavy flashlight in one hand and my phone in the other. The apartment was silent except for the faint hum of the fridge and the occasional creak of the floor. Nothing happened for hours. And then, at 3:17 a.m., the phone buzzed. New photo. With trembling hands, I opened the gallery. The image showed me sitting in the exact position I was in now, my back pressed against the wall. But in the photo, I wasn't alone. There was a figure standing in the doorway behind me. The figure in the photograph was barely visible, its outline blurred as though it were moving when the picture was taken. But there was no mistaking the shape. Tall, hunched slightly, with a head tilted unnaturally to the side. My breath caught in my throat as I turned toward the doorway. It was empty. The shadows seemed deeper, darker, like they were pressing in from all sides. My pulse thundered in my ears as I scanned the room, flashlight trembling in my hand. I shone the beam at the doorway, then the hallway beyond. Nothing. But the air felt wrong, heavy, alive. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The silence that followed was deafening. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl, where every instinct tells you to run. Wesley slid back in his seat, and then I heard it. Lewis's voice was labored. A faint, rasping breath. It wasn't coming from the hallway. It was behind me. I froze, every muscle in my body locking in place. The flashlight slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor and casting wild, jagged shadows across the walls. My phone buzzed again, the sound sharp and jarring in the suffocating quiet. After the week of past 2 months, how do you expect me to think creatively? Another photo. My hands shook as I picked up the phone, my thumb fumbling over the screen. The image loaded slowly, line by agonizing line, revealing a close-up of my own face. My eyes were wide, filled with terror, and in the background, just over my shoulder, was the figure. Its face was inches from mine. I whipped around, swinging the flashlight wildly, but the room was empty. The air felt colder now, biting against my skin like frost. My breaths came in shallow gasps as I stumbled backward, the phone slipping from my grip. And then the lights went out, he said. The darkness was absolute, pressing against my eyes, my chest, my mind. The air was filled with that same rasping breath, louder now, closer, surrounding me. Me, I whispered, the words trembling on my lips. The answer came as a whisper, soft and chilling, right next to my ear. Because you never wake up. The whisper sent a jolt of cold terror through my body, rooting me in place. The air around me felt alive, humming with a low, unnatural vibration. "Wake up," the voice said again, soft and distorted, like a recording played backward. I stumbled backward, my hands reaching blindly for anything to anchor me. The flashlight lay useless on the floor, its beam flickering weakly against the wall. My phone buzzed again. Another fighter. With trembling hands, I picked it up, my breath catching as the image loaded. The photo showed me standing in the center of the room, exactly as I was now. But this time, the figure wasn't behind me. It was in front of me. Its face was impossible to make out, a swirling void where features should have been. Its hand reached toward the phone in my hand, pale and claw-like, stretching impossibly long. It reached the feet away that I'd taken in. "Leave me alone!" I screamed, throwing the phone across the room. It hit the wall with a dull thud, the screen cracking as it fell to the floor. The rasping breath grew louder, filling the room like a storm. The shadows on the walls twisted and writhed, forming shapes that moved and pulsed with a life of their own. Glimpses of Coronal crept into view, revealing some of the window's life of the spatiated elements around her. "You looked," the voice whispered, its tone sharper now, filled with malice. "You saw. And now, you're mine." The room seemed to warp around me, the walls bending and stretching like they were alive. My vision blurred as the shadows surged forward, wrapping around my legs, pulling me toward the center of the room. I screamed, thrashing against their icy grip, but it was no use. The darkness was too strong, too cold, sapping the strength from my body. The figure stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. It reached out with one long pale hand, its touch freezing against my skin. "Perhaps you should recall Herd the way I did." "Who are you?" I choked out, my voice barely audible, and tilted its head, the void where its face should have been seeming to smile. "I am what watches," it said, its voice layered and fractured. "I am what sees. And now, so will you." The shadows pulled me to the floor, the cold seeping into my bones. My vision dimmed as the figure knelt beside me, its hand pressing against my chest. My phone buzzed one last time. The figure leaned in, its voice a whisper against my ear. I smiled. The last thing I saw was the flash of light as the phone took another photo. When the landlord came to check on me a week later, he found the apartment empty. Everything was cleared until he arrived. The furniture was gone, the walls stripped bare. The only thing left was my phone, lying face down on the floor. Mostet. The police retrieved it, hoping for clues. There was only one photo in the gallery. It showed me sitting in the dark, my face twisted in terror, and behind me, just barely visible in the shadows, was the figure. Story 2. The freezer's warning. It started as a minor annoyance. Every night, just as I was drifting off to sleep, the faint popping and cracking of my refrigerator would echo through the apartment. I chalked it up to the usual noises appliances make. Metal expanding and contracting, the hum of the compressor kicking in. But these sounds were different. They were longer. They were too rhythmic, too deliberate, almost like they were trying to form a pattern. Still, I told myself it was nothing and tried to ignore it. Now, until my friend visited, we were sitting in the living room, eating takeout and watching a movie, when the fridge started its nightly performance. My friend paused mid-bite, tilting his head. "That's weird," he said. "What is?" "The sound," he replied, pointing toward the kitchen. "It's too structured, almost like Morse code." "Shit," I laughed, shaking my head. "Yeah, right." Reese grimaced, but he wasn't joking. "You don't hear it, it's got dots and dashes, like a message." I rolled my eyes, but the idea planted itself in my brain. For the rest of the evening, I couldn't stop listening to the sounds, trying to pick out a pattern. And the more I focused on them, the clearer it became. It was a rhythm. The next night, my friend came over again, this time with a notebook and a determination to prove his theory. We sat at the kitchen table, the fridge humming softly beside us. When the popping and cracking started, he leaned forward, scribbling furiously in the notebook. I watched, skeptical but intrigued, as he wrote down a series of dots and dashes. After about 10 minutes, he sat back, frowning. "It's repeating," he said. "To reflect on the episode." "The message," he replied, pointing to the notebook. "It's the same word over and over again." He grabbed his phone, pulling up a Morse code translator. My heart raced as he typed in the sequence. James shrugged. The result was a single word: release. A chill ran down my spine. "It's probably just a coincidence," I said, my voice wavering. "Appliances make weird noises all the time." But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. The message haunted me for the rest of the night. Every time the fridge cracked or popped, I imagined it whispering that word: release. "What ails you wise now, Kate?" ye to me. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was just my imagination, but as I grabbed breakfast, something caught my eye. The freezer door was slightly ajar, frost creeping along the edges. Frowning, I opened it, expecting to find that I hadn't shut it properly. Instead, I found a note. It was small, folded, and frozen solid, encased in a thin layer of frost. My hands shook as I picked it up, the cold biting into my fingers. I had to run it under warm water just to unfold it. Frowning, I checked the skeletal structure to see if there could be a deeper origin. The paper was old, yellowed and brittle, the ink smudged in places. But the words were clear. "You're next." I dropped the note, stumbling back, my chest tightening. My mind raced with questions, none of them with comforting answers. The world seemed to slowly come back to me as I finally got some answers. How had it gotten there? Who put it there? And what did it mean? And couldn't get the note out of my head. All day the words replayed in my mind like a haunting mantra. "You're next." I told myself it was a prank. Maybe my friend was messing with me, trying to spook me after the Morse code incident. But when I asked him about it, he looked genuinely confused. "What note?" he said, frowning. "I didn't put anything in your freezer." Also contrary to Ober's theory. That night I couldn't sleep. The fridge's hum seemed louder, more deliberate, filling the silence like a low chant. And then the popping started again, sharp and rhythmic, cutting through the darkness. End of chapter 30. This time I didn't wait. I grabbed my phone and hit record. Standing in the kitchen, as the fridge bulked in its strange staccato language. When it stopped, I played the recording back. The pattern was unmistakable, more distinct than ever. I pulled up a Morse code translator, typing in the sequence with trembling fingers. The result sent chills racing down my spine. Help! I stared at the screen, my heart hammering in my chest. Help me? Who? Or what? Was asking for help. And then I heard it. Think came from the freezer. The knock was soft, almost imperceptible, but it made my blood run cold. I stared at the freezer door, my breath hitching. You always lied about everything, I said. Knock, knock. This time it was louder, more insistent. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to leave the apartment, to slam the door behind me and never come back. But I couldn't move. With shaking hands, I opened the freezer. The air inside was frigid, clouding around me as I peered inside. At first, everything looked normal. Frozen vegetables, a bag of ice, the tub of forgotten ice cream. But then I saw it. In the back corner of the freezer, buried under a layer of frost, was something that didn't belong. I reached in, my fingers brushing against something cold and metallic. The key was small and rusted, its surface etched with faint, indecipherable markings. My hands trembled as I held it, the cold seeping into my skin. Where it had come from and what it had opened? No answer. The fridge groaned, the sound low and guttural, like a creature stirring in its sleep. The air in the kitchen grew colder, biting against my skin. And then, faintly, I heard it again. Morse code. This time, it wasn't just the fridge. The sound was coming from everywhere. The walls, the floor, the very air around me. It was relentless, overlapping and chaotic, like dozens of voices speaking at once. I clutched the key tightly, my chest tightening as I recognized the pattern. It was a single word, repeated over and over, growing louder with every second. Open. The word echoed in my mind, relentless and deafening. Open. I stared at the key in my hand, its cold metal biting into my palm. My breaths came in short, shallow gasps as I scanned the room. The fridge stood silently now, as if it were waiting. Its hum reduced to a faint whisper. Something was pulling me toward it. I didn't want to obey. Every fiber of my being screamed to throw the key away, to leave the apartment and never look back. But my legs moved on their own, carrying me back to the freezer. Did you finally find yourself back in your body? I hesitated, my fingers trembling as I reached for the door. The air grew heavier, colder, the kitchen lights flickering weakly overhead. With a sharp intake of breath, I opened it. The inside was coated in frost, the cold spilling out in waves. But something was different now. The back wall of the freezer, which had always been smooth metal, was no longer solid. There was a keyhole. My stomach churned as I stared at it. The markings on the key matched perfectly, as though it had been made for this purpose alone. Chat more, das befüllt sein. What do it? A voice whispered faintly, the sound barely audible over the pounding of my heart. I froze, looking around the empty kitchen. The voice had come from nowhere, yet it felt close, intimate, as if spoken directly into my ear. But the fridge had started humming again, louder and more insistent, drowning out my fear with its demand. Open. I slid the key into the lock. The metal turned with an unsettling ease, the mechanism clicking softly. And then, the back wall of the freezer began to shift. It started to move toward me, then slowly it fell apart, collapsing, until I was left with the empty. It didn't open like a door. It melted, the frost and metal dissolving into darkness. The void beyond was endless, pulsing faintly like a living thing. A wave of icy air rushed out, carrying with it a faint metallic tang. My chest tightened as I leaned closer, peering into the abyss. "All right, fellas." Something moved inside. It was faint at first, a shifting shadow that grew clearer with every second. A hand emerged, pale and skeletal, its fingers impossibly long. And then came the face. It wasn't human. Its features were sharp and angular, its hollow eyes filled with an unnatural, pulsating light. Its mouth twisted into a grin, revealing rows of jagged, glistening teeth. "Thank you," it said, its voice a guttural rasp that filled the room. I stumbled back, the icy tendrils of its presence reaching for me, wrapping around my ankles, pulling me toward the darkness. My screams echoed in the empty kitchen as the creature emerged fully, its twisted form towering over me. "You're next," it whispered, its voice layered and fractured. "You freed me, and now you'll take my place." The last thing I saw was its grin, as the void swallowed me whole. When the new tenants moved into the apartment, they were thrilled with the rent. It was cheap, spacious, and came with a modern fridge that hummed softly in the corner. The humming grew louder at night, rhythmic and deliberate. One of them joked that it sounded like Morse code. The fridge replied with a single word: "Help."